Hi everyone, I'm Chris Saxon, part of Stephen Feuerstein's Oracle Developer Advocate team. I'm part of the regular AskTOM team, as well as Stephen Feuerstein's Oracle Developer Advocate team. It's my job to help you get the best out of Oracle database and hopefully have a little bit of fun whilst doing so. So that in mind today, we've got today's SQL Office Hours session, and we're going to be looking at database releases, so something that is you all have to deal with one way or another, whether you're developing changes to put into production or you're a DBA who helps support put those changes into production. And this kind of relates to a question that we had come in from someone in advance. So let me go back to the screen and share that up here. Alrighty then. So someone had a question come in and they say they've got a global 24/7 application and it's used constantly, and from time to time they can have these kind of API storms, and they're wondering if it's kind of safe to do DDL, do schema changes during these storms. So there's kind of a lot to kind of unpick here in this kind of in the question. First, we'll think about what does an API storm really mean, and this is something that's going to be very application specific about what's actually going on. But basically, you've got a situation, you've got your general day-to-day running of your application, and then suddenly it's a web-facing app. It gets featured in some big newsletter on a high-profile website, and you get a big increase in traffic very suddenly. And this is something you can't predict or can't control because it's handled, someone in the outside world picks it up and suddenly sends a whole bunch of traffic to your site, and you just got to kind of deal with it. So at this point, you've got a big spike in activity. And so they were kind of wondering, well, we've got these database releases, we can't have downtime. How can we manage DDL changes here, or is it safe? Does Oracle support this? And I think say we'll support the database working how it does. We're going to explain how database release processes happen, what happens when you try and run DDL while people are actually using your application. So as long as you understand that and work with those parameters, then you should be fine. However, there is something that is worth thinking about, worth trying to understand, and that is your database server overloaded? So you've got this API storm or application storm, and you've doubled, trebled, maybe even more the activity that your application is doing, so how much work the database is doing. So the first thing to think about is, are you at or near the capacity of the database server that you've got? Because as soon as you are, then any extra work you've done is going to potentially cause problems. So the closer and closer you get to 100% CPU usage, the more things start to kind of fall apart a bit. You get, CPU queuing going on and stuff like that. And generally, it's not going to be a great experience for your users. So you don't really want to be going out and doing anything extra on top of that when something really busy is happening. So that's the first thing to note. If you know that you're in the middle of some big increase or spike in activity, you don't really want to be adding anything extra to this, particularly if you are near the capacity. And this kind of can create a lot of, or traditionally created a lot of problems for resource capacity planning. You've got your baseline level of activity. There's probably some peaks and troughs in the day-to-day normal activity, normal use of your application. But at any time, it could suddenly spike up to 2 or 3 times that. You need to provision a server which is, 3 to 4 times larger than you would if you just had regular predictable growth. So this can lead to you having to buy much bigger hardware than you would. And this is a situation where cloud really can help, because this is where you can start looking at dynamically allocating more or less resources as you needed. So in particular, Autonomous Database, one of the key features of that is it allows you to add more CPUs in response to increased traffic, and then deallocate them again when things have quieted down a bit. So you're only paying for the CPUs you're actually using, so you can respond to these big increases or dips and troughs in your activity. So this is somewhere, if you've got really peaky traffic, somewhere where cloud can really help. So you don't need to think quite so hard about resource capacity planning and buy a server that is significantly larger than you need for normal activity, just to cover for the case when something crazy happens. So that's a really good reason to look at cloud. But let's kind of take this off the table for now. Let's imagine that however you've managed it, you've bought a huge, massive, beefy server, or you've got autonomous database or some other cloud solution which allows you to scale appropriately with your traffic. So you don't really have to worry about hitting, your server limits. And you're fine if you've got an API storm, you can go on, do whatever you want, and you're not going to cause further delays and further draw back your application. So what then? What about doing the database release? And as I said, we're in a 24/7 global application. Can we do this, keep everything running? Well, first thing to note is that in an Oracle database, you can do most DDL operations online. So while people are doing their transactions, querying, insert, update, delete their table, you can go and run DDL against them at the same time with no issues. However, there are two classes of DDL in Oracle database, or two broad classes. That is blocking and non-blocking DDL. Non-blocking DDL is the form that you want to make sure your application works hunky-dory while you're doing a database release, a schema change. So let's just see how these work and what really happens in practice when you run a non-blocking or a blocking DDL. So the first thing to note is people are using your application, so they're inserting some values, and there might be an uncommitted transaction when you come to actually do your release. So people are still using it as normal, creating their orders, doing whatever it is they do. You come along and start a release. Now at this point, we've got session 1 and it has an uncommitted transaction. Now, regardless of whether you're running blocking DDL or non-blocking DDL, this will stop you running any DDL against that table. So if we try and run an alter table here, this uncommitted transaction in session 1 then blocks our add in session 2. So this cannot complete until session 1 completes. So if you have a lot of long running transactions for some reason, so some background batch processes which take 20 minutes, an hour, whatever to run, and only commit at the end, think about whether you really want to be doing your releases while they actually run, because you could have quite a nervous time waiting for these alter tables to actually complete while you wait for those transactions to stop. So that's one thing to watch for. Do you have any background processes which are going to have long-running transactions, or does the nature of your application mean you have a lot of long-running transactions? If you don't, however, and you've just got your normal day-to-day customers creating orders, creating accounts, whatever it is, and everything's generally pretty quick, then normally you probably won't even notice this because the transactions will complete, the alter table will run, everything will be fine. So, but even if you do have these long-running transactions blocking your alter table, any other sessions, any other DML on them can continue just fine. So we can keep inserting, updating, and deleting in table in a third, fourth, fifth session, even though my alter table here is blocked. So it doesn't matter that these two are kind of holding each other up. Ideally, you don't really want to leave them there forever because it's not great, but Oracle database, it doesn't escalate locks. We're not going to use up huge numbers of resources waiting for these. So it's just kind of your own comfort and sanity waiting for these to finish. Everything else can continue as normal while you've got non-blocking DDL going on, even if it's waiting for other DML to complete. So that's non-blocking DDL. That's where you want to be if you're doing online database releases. What about blocking DDL? Well, this is similar, but what actually happens when you've got an uncommitted transaction? Unlike non-blocking DDL, it will bomb out straight away. So you try and run the alter table, and an example of something that is blocking is altering a column, increasing the length of a varchar2, something like that, and you get this aura54 resource busy error. So we've got our uncommitted insert, alter table, fails, but because it's failed, everyone else can still keep doing whatever they want to do. So you then now to think, well, how can we rerun this alter table? And that's tricky because potentially, what do? Do you give it 5 minutes and run again? Do you run in a tight loop? There isn't really an obvious solution here, particularly if you're really busy and you've got a lot of these inserts happening all the time, thousands a second, say. How do you solve this? Now, one technique you can do, and one thing people might notice, is there's this DDL lock timeout parameter. And when you set this, if you've got a blocking DDL and it is waiting on some other DML to finish, it will then pause. It will pause for that duration. So we said they're 60, so that's 60 seconds. We are now in a situation where session 2 is waiting on session 1 for 60 seconds. But because it's blocking, session 3 is now also waiting for this alt table. So you've gone in the situation and said, well, we'll just wait a while before we bomb out with the resource busy error. But this is a situation where you really can start bringing your application to its knees. 60 seconds on a busy application, that's probably going to introduce some real serious queuing, have a lot of slowdown in your application. It's not a good situation to be in. The value or the unit of this parameter, the DDL lock timeout, is the second. So the smallest you can set it to is wait 1 second. So that's good in the sense that you've got 1 second in for outstanding transactions to complete. But it's also bad that, again, in really busy applications, 1 second could be enough to really start backing up all the other DML that's come in since you started that alter table. So you need to be careful when you've got this blocking DDL and figure out what's happened. So as I said, we set it to 60 seconds. We're now stuck for that amount of time. Eventually it will finish, assuming that session 1 doesn't commit. Hopefully session 1 commits in this time. If it doesn't, we'll get the resource busy, all the other DML completes, and things get running again. So something to be aware and consider there. So any questions or comments on that before we move on? Okay, no, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so let's move on. So the key thing to remember is, if you've got busy application, look at how much server capacity you've got on your database. If you're maxing out whatever CPUs you've already got, going on and then starting to do releases, it's probably not the best idea. Cloud solutions like Autonomous Database can help you grow elastically, which can help solve these problems. But still, I would be wary about starting to do a new release while the application is really busy. However, you might be partway through a release and suddenly things really spike. You can't control that, but everything, as long as you've got non-blocking DDL, everything should continue. So see, we've got some comments come in from Judith. Even worse than blocking the waiting are the invalidations that the DDL might cause. Can you expand on that, Judith, or got some examples of when that's happened to you? That'd be good. Or because I think I'm going to move on and talk a bit about managing the release process itself. And here's, I'm going to be really interested to get some comments from you, see how you approach it, because everyone has their own ideas about the best way to do this. So Hani, do we have a parameter to define the number of retry to DDL? So if we go back up, so this DDL lock timeout is basically saying how long you wait to retry it. It will keep retrying for this number of seconds. So 60 seconds, it'll keep going. And if in that time, the other whatever was blocking it hasn't committed, then it will stop. So this is essentially the retry parameter, and it just keeps retrying for the duration of that period. So I hope that answers your question, Hani. All right, so from Judith, for example, invalidating PL/SQL objects, stateful packages that are in use. Okay, so I think we'll come back to PL/SQL invalidation and stuff like that a bit later on, Judith, because that's a good point and something worth discussing. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, not seeing anything else, so let's move on. So that's kind of looking at the technical aspects. Look at what capacity you've got and also be aware of the difference between blocking and non-blocking DDL. as much as possible, aim to ensure you have non-blocking DDL. Okay, so that's the technical aspects. What about the more kind of managerial aspects? How do we actually manage the release? How do we package it up, make sure we know what we're doing and everything's going to be fine? So one of the key and most important things I want to say here is that DDL is source code, all right? As a fact that seems to be lost on some people. So what do we do with all our source code? So hopefully someone can tell me in chat, you've got your application code, your PL SQL, your Java code, where whatever it is, where do you store it other than in the database? Oh, Git, yes. Well, source control, exactly. So you should be storing your DDL in source control. If you're not, fix it now, right? Okay. Now there are a lot of people have a lot of different approaches and techniques for how they organize DDL into source control. I've seen a lot of different approaches. Some people split it out, so you've got different folders per object type. So tables go in their own folder, indexes go in another folder. Others try and group things together by like functionality, or have all the code, or all the indexes, constraints, and so on for a table go in the same folder or even the same file. Lots of different techniques. I'd like to hear how you've done it. So if anyone's willing to share, please do. But what I would say is the technique that I've used and I really liked is Oracle Data Modeler. So I like this for a couple of reasons. First up, it's a nice kind of GUI interface, so you can actually visualize your schema diagram, see what's going on, easily see the relationships, but it integrates with SVN, and it has a really nice kind of diff utility, so you can see what's there and what's changed. So you can see in the example here, we've removed a column and we're changing the data type of department name, and we're deleting this XYZ column. So you get some really good diff capabilities for your schema, which quite often you don't really get, or it's hard to see when you're doing that with create tables and things like that. So, excuse me, I think this is really good. One thing to note, it only supports SVN, and as Joseph is saying, Git is now the dominant source control repository, so you've got to think about how you want to handle that there. But the key thing here is you are source controlling it, so you know what your changes are. And then once you've got everything packaged together, or you know what all the changes you need are for a release, you're packaging them together to produce a release script. So this is an area, as I said, I'd like to hear about what other people do. I think this is an interesting topic, and used to be part of my day job. So if anyone's got any comments or about how they do it, suggestions on what they like, dislike, then please put them in the comments, or feel free to chat. We can unmute you if you want. No one feeling brave enough to stand up and join the conversation? That's fine. Okay, if you, I'm keeping an eye on the comments, so if you're typing away, just keep going and we'll pick them up later. So you're checking your DDL into source control, and whether that's Oracle Data Modeler, Git, some other tool, whatever it is, you've got your changes in, and you're grouping together your DDL into a release script. So the output of this is something you will run against the database to bring it from the current version to the next version to support whatever changes you need for the next version of the application. So the key thing here is this process should be repeatable. The script that you have should be able to, you should be able to run it and get the same result every single time. And the key thing is not only, so we've got our version 1 of the application, we run our release skip against the schema, takes it up to version 2. Not only do you have a release, you should also have a rollback, which undoes all those changes. And you should be able to keep kind of going round and round in this circle as many times as you want, and you'll always bring the schema either down to version 1 or up to version 2. And this will be, a very thorough, repeated process. test this, get your QA or pre-production or whatever it is database, run this until you're happy with it. Can take a lot of goes. This used to be part of my day job, preparing these things. Complicated releases can take several goes to get them right, make sure everything's fine. But I think it's really key that you do this, because building confidence in your release enables you to push it into production more safely without having to worry about the release itself failing. You're then more down into unexpected or weird things happening when you actually do that. Okay, so we've got a comment from Judith in our org. They had a third-party source control which is linked to Toad, and releases were always done within about 1 day downtime using a proprietary deployment tool that translated the release scripts into an XML file. Well, never used EBR. That sounds like a very clunky, painful process, Judith. So you actually had to take the application offline for a day to do these releases. That's doesn't sound good. Okay, so Shankar, how does this compare to version A from scratch and B from scratch to V2? No rollback to V1. So this is, you're saying if you installing completely, you've got a blank schema, for example, is that what you're saying, Shankar? How would you go run through all of them? Sorry, typically for dev. Okay, so you're in your development environments. Yes, okay. Yeah, so the idea is that actually, we've got version 1, version 2 here. You're going to start building up a lot of these versions. You get up to version 100, maybe even 1,000 over time. In theory, you should be able to take a completely fresh schema and just deploy all the releases starting from version 1, then deploy version 2, and just keep going until version N, whichever that is. And that you'll be able to run the whole thing through and then roll it back to any point in between. So that's the theory, right? You'll be able to, given a new completely blank database, all it's got is the schema, maybe. I mean, maybe even part of the release would be creating the schema. Version 1 is create the schema itself. You should be able to run through the whole thing. Obviously, in practice, doesn't always quite work as smoothly as that, but in theory, you should be able to do that. So as you say, if you've got a new dev environment, you should be able to build it to a particular version of that schema, because quite often, if you have to support different customer sites, so you're deploying your application on site for different customers, they could all be at slightly different versions of the schema. So to investigate a bug or to look at an enhancement request, you need to get your development environment to match whatever they've got. So yes, you should be able to do that up to or back to whatever version it is. Oh, yes. So you did to see, yes, and there was also a general rehearsal done prior to the real upgrade for measuring runtimes, correcting errors. Yeah, okay. That sounds quite painful, Judith. I think that sounds like there's some streamlining which could definitely be done there. So does that help, Shankar? Yes, cool. Okay, so as I said, we've got this thing where you should be able to go forwards or backwards from any version to any other version. However, there's one thing which I've kind of glossed over or overlooked completely, and that is the data itself. So these release scripts will change the schema, do the alter tables, create tables, and so on. But what happens if there's data in those tables? What do you do there, or how do you solve that problem? So let's say we've done our release, customers are using it, and there's now real customer and data in there. So our release is creating a table, adding some columns. Well, the inverse of creating tables and adding columns is dropping tables and dropping columns, right? So as part of our rollback, we are going to lose that data. And it's like, well, what do we do with that? You've got real customer information in there, and you can't just willy-nilly go ahead and drop it. Now, some situations this might be acceptable. Maybe it's a new feature which isn't really relevant to most of your customers, or maybe they hate it and they want you to get rid of it, so they don't want the data anyway. But in a lot of situations, particularly anything to do with financial information, so your payment transactions, your invoices, and so on, if you've added schema objects which are going to store that kind of data, you can't then just roll it back because there's some problem. because you need to keep that data. You need to figure out what you're going to do about this. Now, there isn't really a good answer about exactly what you're going to do here. What's the best approach? You're going to have to handle this on a case-by-case scenario. It might be that you temporarily take a copy of that data before you run the rollback, so you can replay it later or something like that. Maybe it means that you can't do a rollback and you have to do a release v3, which undoes some of the changes but not all of them. You will have to handle that case by case. However, big step to help you reduce this problem is to decouple the schema and application releases. So you handle those as entirely separate events. And so you deploy your schema change, adding some tables, adding some columns. When you're happy that is fine, you then deploy your application. So what this means is we start off a situation like this. We got our application and our database both on version 1. We'll then deploy our schema changes. We'll create some tables, add some columns, for example, and now we run for a period where the database is on version 2, but the application is still on version 1. So we haven't upgraded the application at this point. What this means is, if for some reason something went horribly wrong in the database release, or there's some problem that means we need to back it out, you can then back it out fairly safely. We can just undo that, and we got no customer data because it's new tables. We're not storing anything in there. So we could put that information. We can do this, and you'll run for a period of time until you're kind of confident that you're not going to need to roll back that database release. How long that is really depends on you. Could be as little as a few hours, could be several days. I would tend to keep that window pretty small, under a week, just because otherwise you're then potentially having more application releases and database releases kind of conflicting with each other. But you'll have some period where you're in a situation like this, where you've got the new version of the schema, but the old version of the application. Then when you're happy that's worked, you can then roll out the new version of the application to use the new version of the schema. So we've decoupled these releases, handled them as completely separate events. So there's a couple of advantages here. First up, we're just changing fewer things at once. If we do both at the same time, we take down the database, we deploy the schema changes, deploy the app, there's just more chance that something will go wrong. Something could go wrong in the database release, something could go in the application release, and there could be something that goes wrong in the interface between them. Well, my favorite, or I say favorite in inverted quotes, is something really trivial like missing a grant. So you've got big database release, you do it, it all looks fine. You've got application release, looks fine, but because you missed a grant, it doesn't use the new version of the database correctly, and now you're stuck. You've got these errors, and it's like, what do we do? Do we roll back? Do we plow on? It's just a tricky situation. If you're doing these one at a time, then you know what's caused the problem. So if you deploy the new version of your schema and everything falls over, you know it's something to do with the schema. If if you've got the schema out, deploy the new version of your application, everything falls over, you know it's something to do with the application. So you're doing less things in each release, making it easier to identify what any potential problems are, also making it less likely that errors would in fact occur. So important we decouple this. The thing to note here is when we do this, you're also going to have to make sure you're building your applications so they support this. That means things like no select star operations, right? Shouldn't be doing it anyway, but this makes it absolutely critical. But it also just means that you can move them more independently. Okay, so I see there's some comments come in, and I'll just kind of run back through those. So Judith, can't flashback database be used as a rollback tool? So that's a really good point there, actually, Judith. And it's something that I have used as like a fallback, a guaranteed way to say, if everything goes wrong here, we can always get back to this release point, get back to this point. So for those of you not familiar, what you can do is create something called a guaranteed restore point. And then with that in place, if something goes hideously wrong in your database release or database generally, you can always flash back to exactly that point in time. So this is potentially very useful as like a, everything's gone hideously wrong. We just need to get the hell back out and restart. There are some problems with it, or some gotchas with this. First up, to do a flashback database, you will have to shut down your database. So you are going to have to have a period of outage. So if you're trying to do this all online, that means you cannot have a online rollback. So watch out for that. Second thing is, because you're flashing back the whole database, it also means you've lost completely all data written since you made that restore point. Again, this makes it kind of tricky to do use in an online scenario, because not only are you looking at the tables you've changed, but you're looking at everyone else's tables as well. So this ensures that this means you've lost not only changes from the tables you're affecting, but every table in the database. So it's a good insurance policy, but it is kind of a nuclear option. So, use it your own. I like having it as just a guaranteed fallback should the worst happen, but it really should be a fallback if the worst happens. So I hope that clarifies or answers that, Judith. Okay, so comment from Pete K. I do this with Apex apps sometimes. Can apply the new tables, etc., to the live database before the app knows about them, then update the app later when ready tested. That's a great approach, Pete, and exactly the kind of thing I'm advocating here, because then it ensures that you're not getting caught out with these kind of things. Okay, so Ravi, this approach may not be workable when there are changes to existing packages, when V2 package conflicts with V1 app code. Okay, so I'll talk about package changes. So far, I'm talking only about schema changes. So table changes, index changes, that kind of thing. I'm not talking about PL SQL at this point. We'll come back to PL SQL in a minute, Ravi, because I think something we'll say, as Yuda's been hinting at, there's something else we can say there. Yeah, so at the moment, I'm only talking about table indexes, that kind of thing. And when I say application, that also includes PL SQL changes. So quite often you might roll up your PL SQL changes within a schema release, but actually I would try and decouple those as well. Be able to make your table changes independent of whether you're changing any code whatsoever. Okay, so Judith, see your point, and we'll come to that in a second. Okay, so we've decoupled our release. Next thing we're going to look at, I'll return to that blocking versus non-blocking scenario we were discussing earlier. And as I said, most operations in Oracle database now are non-blocking. However, there is a key one, which you are a good chance you'll bump into, is modifying the length of a column. So increasing the size of a varchar 2. That is a blocking operation. So how can you avoid this? Well, rather than doing a modify of the column, which is blocking, you can churn it into an add a column with the extended length, which is non-blocking. So we've increased the size of our column, but now we've got 2 columns, and we need to find some way to switch the application to go from the old to the new, and we also need to copy all the old data over. Yeah, so kind of complicated, right? Well, as Yuda's been hinting at for a while, there's this really cool technology we've got called addition-based redefinition, which can help you with this. So this is designed to enable you to do 0 downtime database releases, whether that's schema changes or PL SQL changes. And how does this work? Very briefly. So this is a big topic, and there's a lot to cover on it. So I'm just going to give you the 5-minute overview. But basically, what this does is it extends the namespace to include something called an addition. So when you connect, the fully qualified name of an object is now addition .schema.object name. And your session, part of the properties of the session is the edition name. So what that means is you can have 2 copies of an object in a database. Most objects. You can't do it for things like tables. So what we have is something called an editioning view, which you would create over the top of the tables. So if we're increasing the length of the column, rather than doing a blocking alter table modify, we can do an alter table add for the new column. And then our new edition, we point it to the new column. So we're telling it to use that increased column. And then at some point, we'll flip the application to use from edition 1 over to edition 2. So that's kind of made this kind of transparent and seamless to the application. But what about all that data, right? We've got all the old values in column 1. We need to transfer them all to column 2. And also you need to kind of keep these additions in sync. People are still using this old application. We're doing this online. We need to be writing those changes to our new column until we've migrated everyone over. So we've got this lovely little thing called a cross-edition trigger, and we can use that to go copy the data backwards and forwards. So this is a very powerful technique which you can use to do some of these more advanced application releases. Increasing column length is one of them that you can now do transparently by going from a blocking alter table modify to a non-blocking alter table add. And going back to the PL SQL thing that Ravi was mentioning, this also allows you to edition your PL SQL code. So we could have in edition 1, package version 1, and we can have a different version or new code for that same package in edition 2. So we can have 2 copies of the same PL SQL procedure running in the same database, depending on which edition we're connected to. We can see different versions of the code. So this enables us to do kind of hot rollover, roll out the changes in the new edition no one's using, migrate them over, assuming everything's fine, we'll keep going. If something goes wrong, we just point them back to the original edition. Okay, so if you've got questions or comments on that, please put them in the chat. As I said, this is a big feature. There's a lot to cover on this. So if you want to know more, there's a lot of online reading you could do about that. So just note, there's a question from Joseph Fuda. Is there a list of all blocking operations documented somewhere? So this is a good question, Joseph. And then the answer is kind of sort of. In the docs, there is a section about blocking. If you look for blocking and non-blocking DDL in the docs, there is a section there. However, it's not exactly complete in the sense that the most recent versions of the docs only list the things that have changed since 11.2. So things that have changed from blocking to non-blocking since 11.2. Adding a column with a nullable column with no default has been non-blocking for as long as I can remember. I'm not even sure if it ever has been as long as I've been using Oracle database. So that's not listed there because it was already non-blocking when you started 11.2. So that lists the changes since 11.2. So how do you know if it's blocking or non-blocking? Very simple, easiest way. Start a session, insert a row into the table, leave it uncommitted, and in a second session, just run the DDL against that table you're planning to do. If you get hit instantly with the ORA54 resource busy error, it's a blocking DDL. Okay, so that's the way you'll know straight away. Oren says Oracle 6. Okay, so that's quite a bit before my time. So thanks, Oren. Yes, I never 8's the oldest I've used. So that's a good thing that has been quite a while. So yes, what is blocking and what's not blocking does change very frequently between releases. We're getting more and more things are moving to the non-blocking column. However, there are some things you can do which will prevent that. Enable supplemental logging for your database will convert a lot of traditionally non-blocking operations to be blocking. So it's always worth double checking on your own environment. Okay, so run it, have a session, have an uncommitted insert, run the DDL you want. If it hangs there, it's non-blocking. If it bombs out straight away with an RF54, it's blocking. As Judith says, it's kind of counterintuitive that increasing the column size is considered more severe than adding a new column because they can equally break an application. Good addition here from Oren. Note that every operation that requires the keyword online for non-blocking is not supported by standard edition. So thanks for pointing that out, Oren. Another good reason to make sure you check this yourself and see how it works. A lot of the altered tables now have this online keyword at the end, which you need to make them be non-blocking. So if you're on standard edition, double check that. So Judith, it's kind of that increasing the column size is considered more severe than adding a new column. Well, I think when you're increasing the length of a column, you're increasing something that's already present. Whereas, and people are potentially already using that. Whereas if it's something new, assuming you've decoupled your releases and you're not writing select stars, then in theory, nobody's using a new column. So I'm not surprised that that happens. I'm sure we're working on ways to get increasing the length be non-blocking because it is a relatively common operation. There's certainly things that I've seen people bump into from time to time, but I don't know the full background on that. If anyone does know more, please say. Are the database blocks effectively modified when we increase a column, length? When you run the alter table immediately, I don't know offhand. I'd have to check. Okay, any other questions or comments before we kind of move to the wrap up for this? No? Okay, so here's some kind of general tips, my advice. Now, this is all based on my experience and my thoughts. Feel free to disagree with me. If you do, let's say so in chat. We'll have a discussion. That's part of what we're here for. So first thing I would say is try to release as often as you can. So a lot of people get set in the mindset of database releases are risky. We should avoid doing risky things. However, I think actually you should do the opposite. Things that are risky or risky things that you need to do, like a database release, you should actually seek to do more often. Why? Well, let's take a relatively extreme example. Let's say you say, we've only got one window where we can do database releases a year. So that means you've got to collect up everything together into one release, and then you schedule a weekend or whatever it is where you try and get everything done. So there's a couple of problems. There's lots of problems with this. First up, you're making the business have to wait potentially a full year before they can get any changes. Lots of businesses aren't really going to be happy about having to wait that long. So that's kind of like a non-technical part of it. But also, the more things you pack into a release, the more likely it is that just something will go wrong. Someone will make a mistake. If it's something that was done 9 months ago, chances are you've completely forgotten or what it was about. Maybe even the developers or the team who worked on it have moved on, they've left the company, gone to a different team. So you can't speak to them if there is a problem. So you don't know how to resolve it. Also, if you've only got one release window a year, well, what do you do if it goes wrong, right? Okay, you should have a rollback script to undo it, but then you've got to wait. You're going to have to wait another year to roll out your database changes. That's not good, right? You've gone from a once a year release schedule to a once every 2 years because something went wrong and you had to back everything out. And then you're at awkward situation of, well, do we hack around and try and figure out how to solve this, or do we just down tools, forget it, and come back next year? Again, most businesses aren't going to be very happy about it if you say, well, that thing you had to wait 9 months for, you're going to have to wait another year for. Not very good. Also, a year is just about long enough for people to forget all the caveats and gotchas and the things that went wrong. That configuration file that you're supposed to update to make sure everything works right. You kind of go, oh, we did it last year, we documented it, and then it comes down to the new release this year, and everyone's forgotten. People on the team have changed, whatever, and it's really easy to overlook these small details, which can cause problems with your release. Whereas if you're releasing really frequently, say every week or even potentially more often, you're ironing out these problems. You're getting used to what the issues are. The changes themselves are also going to be smaller. You've only got a week, couple of weeks, maybe a month's worth of work to put into each release. So there's less likely that something's going to go wrong. You get more confidence in your processes. You figure out what you do. If things do fail, how do we roll back safely and effectively? So the more often you do it, yes, you probably will have things go wrong more often, but you'll also get more competent, more confident at dealing with those. So, I would say you really should be pushing to do your database releases as often as you need to. If it's a small application that has one change request a year, yeah, you probably only need to release once a year. But if it's a key application for the database, for the business, and you've got constant development going on it, you should be releasing, I would say, at least once a month, probably more often. Obviously, depends on exactly what you're doing and what your rate of change of your schema is. So release often. Next thing also is to help support that is to kind of automate your processes as much as possible. As I said earlier, as part of the release process, you should have a single script that you can run, which deploys all your changes, and a single script you can run, which will back everything back out again. There are various tools available which can help automate database releases for you. I haven't played with any of them in enough detail to really discuss the strengths of them, but we'll say if you've got a script and you've tested it and you've got confidence in it, then you can even just schedule that, run it with the database scheduler or run a shell script or something like that and have that run kind of on demand when you need it to. This frees up, your production support team, so they're not having to do releases all the time. It's worrying how often in my career I saw people, just kind of cobble together database releases at the last minute and say, okay, we've got these 3 or 4 files, we'll just open them up in SQL Developer and then run them, and if that works, we'll run the next one. It's just horrendous. Okay, your script should be tested thoroughly, should be completely automatable, should be something you can just kind of hit button, run. Obviously, this is going to be a bit of a journey. If currently you're doing things quite manual and ad hoc, I wouldn't say just go straight from that to having a script that you run with on a scheduler job or something like that. Build it up, get to more confidence in your process, and when you got to the point where you've done several releases, even some that have failed that you had to roll back and handle those in a completely scripted way, then you can get confidence and get to the point where actually you can just have something that will schedule these to happen at a particular time, and then you just got people on call should something go wrong. So look to automate these. Try as much as possible to automate your releases. Yes, and Dennis says, and make this single script idempotent. Yes, you should be able to. Running it multiple times shouldn't end up with different results. If you have a release script, in the ideal world, you'll have some process that identifies the database is already at version 2, so don't actually run the script at all. But if that's beyond you for whatever reason at the moment, then running it twice shouldn't then end up causing further changes to your database. So great point there. Judith, one way making DDLs idempotent by wrapping them PL SQL. Not too funny to do. Yeah, you can wrap them PL SQL. So yeah, I mean, one thing you can do, sadly we don't have the drop or if exists or create if exists commands in Oracle database, which makes certainly for rollback, if a release is changing 4 tables, it fails halfway through, well, the rollback, whichever part of that release didn't run, the rollback is going to have nothing to do. So it's going to drop tables which genuinely don't exist because they never get rolled out. So on the one hand, it'd be kind of nice to do that. On the other hand, you could just have a process that reviews the error log. Not great. This is one of the more requested features on the database ideas forum, is to have this drop or create if exists. I'm not aware of plans to do so at the moment, though. Okay. Any other comments? I'll move on. So another thing to mention, make sure you're checking whether or not your DDL is blocking or non-blocking. As we've kind of discussed, there is information in the docs, but as Aaron points out, if you're on standard edition, not everything that's said to be non-blocking may turn out to be that case. So always do a double check on your version, particularly as we've got more versions of the database coming more frequently. Expect more of these things to become non-blocking over time, because that's what we're going to strive to do. We live in a online 24/7 world. We want to help support you to be able to manage your applications in that way. So this will change, but always double check. It's always worth checking. And as we've kind of talked about a bit, consider looking at edition-based redefinition. There is a lot to this. You can use it to help manage your schema changes. You can help convert that alter table modifier column to a longer length from a blocking to a non-blocking by adding a column with that longer length instead. Something I think edition-based redefinition is brilliant for is helping deploy your PL SQL changes, because that allows you to have the old and the new version of your PL SQL side by side in the same database, and you can actually test and validate that the new version works before you make it live. So that is absolutely perfect for that functionality. If you've got a lot of PL SQL, I urge you to go out and try EBR just to help make those database PL SQL releases easier. Okay, let's come back to the comments. So from Joseph, so in other words, would you recommend using the online keyword wherever possible? Yes, so Joseph, yes, look at the online keyword wherever possible. Check if it is genuinely, you're on Enterprise Edition, you haven't got supplemental logging, or there is no other weird restrictions that you've somehow encountered. But the thing remember here is I'm looking at a world where you need to run this changes with your application still actually running. Still worth bearing in mind that the easiest way is still to just kind of shut down the database or disable access to your database for a brief period of time, do the release, and then make it available again. For many of us, that is not an option. Some of us, that is an option. If the business you support is a physical business or quite region specific. So, I worked for a UK airline in the past, and basically all their traffic was from people in the UK with some from the EU. So overnight in UK time, there was very little activity, even on the main public-facing website. So actually, an hour or two's worth of downtime overnight, business could live without, because no one was really looking at it anyway. However, it's still better to try and strive not to be in that scenario, because it just gets you more confidence for the other applications, or other things which do need that full online support all the time. But yeah, try and consider, do you really need to do this as an online operation? Okay, some more comments. So Dennis, if you're crazy enough to deploy your updates online, I'd rather use the restricted session wherever it's possible. So can you expand, you say your updates online, can you expand on that a bit, Dennis, what you're referring to there? Okay, Judith, what about using DBMS utility wait on pending DML before attempting DDL? I think one of the things potentially you've got to watch for is if your application's big enough. That was my answer to you, this, Chris, right? Sorry, that's right, Judith. So waiting for pending DDL. So things to watch for there is, of course, if you've got long-running transactions for whatever reason, you might be waiting quite a while. But if you've got really busy application where you've just got continually running DML, then you could be waiting quite a while. It's not something I've really played with, that DBMS utility. If anyone's got experience with it, then please share. I'm keen to hear what you think of it. But I'd say with non-blocking DDL, you don't really need to. And with blocking DDL, you kind of need to be a bit careful about what you're doing with your release anyway. So think about what's going on there. Okay. So we're getting close to the hour now. So any other comments, questions, suggestions before we finish up? Any chance answer on my question? So Dennis, was that your question that just came in about 10 minutes before this session or something like that? Yep. I haven't had a chance to look at it properly yet, Dennis. Sorry about that. So need a bit more notice before I can get to these things. I'll reply to you privately in a bit. Okay. All right then. So we're pretty much at the hour now. So actually, we've got a quick question from Brian. For an existing database, how easy is it to implement EBR versus starting from scratch? It's a good question, Brian. And it's probably best we follow up about that separately. Okay, but otherwise, I just want to say, I hope you enjoyed this. More importantly, I hope you learned something. Thanks all for joining me. I hope to see you again next month for both the SQL and PL SQL office hour sessions, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.